If you enjoy this video, please consider giving a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you have any ideas for future videos, share them in the comments section below. This original bedtime story is made possible thanks to Slumberland patrons. If you would like to support this channel, you can find Patreon details in the description and on my channel homepage. So just take a moment to allow your eyes to close and allow yourself to begin to relax. And as you begin to relax, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my voice or whether it'll be to the spaces between my words. And as you continue to comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell this sleep story in the background. And this is a sleep story about Dexter. And Dexter is working in a science lab. And while he's working in this science lab, he's finding it incredibly frustrating while he's attempting to perfect a certain chemical reaction. He's trying to find a way of being able to mix two chemicals based on an equation that he had developed that would allow for the formation of an incredibly efficient energy source. And he continues to try different combinations in the lab. And many of the combinations he finds either get no result at all, no reaction happens, or the reaction is too powerful. And so every single day, Dexter comes into his lab and tries really hard to figure out the answer, to work out how to get things just so. And one day, while Dexter is between finishing one experiment and thinking about starting the next, and trying to think what else he can try, how else he can perform this experiment. While he's thinking about that, he decides to take a break. He goes outside, he stretches his legs, breathes in some fresh air, points his face up in the direction of the sun with his eyes closed to feel the warmth of that sun on his face, to allow the blue light from the sun to help him to feel more alert and awake. And he knows that it'll take perhaps 20 minutes for that alertness to begin to kick in. But working in a dark science lab means that a few times through the day he does this to re-energize himself. And so in the 20 minutes it'll take for him to be re-energized, he heads back inside. He finds an incredibly comfortable seat, relaxes down in that seat, closes his eyes, and lets his mind wander and lets himself drift and float comfortably into a reverie. And in this reverie, while he rests there so comfortably, he finds himself walking through a forest. And as he walks through this forest, so he can hear the forest birds around him, hear the sound of each footstep that he takes. He can feel the damp, warm air on his skin. And he pushes through this forest. And after a while, he manages to reach a clearing. And from this clearing, he can see over the tree line of the rest of the forest he'll be travelling through tomorrow, and off to the mountain range in the distance. That's his target destination. And he sets up camp in this clearing, lights a campfire, settles down in the entrance of a tent. He has something to eat and watches the way the fire dances in front of him, the crackling sound the fire's making, the occasional sparks from the fire rising up into the sky. And as he watches, he notices particles seeming to just float around in the air. And he almost begins to feel something connecting inside his mind, a bit like jigsaw pieces being put in place. And as he watches the dancing particles in the air, the way the clouds move across the stars and the moon, how relaxing this environment feels, how much cooler it becomes at night time. He settles down in the tent and drifts so peacefully and comfortably asleep. And the next day, Dexter awakens in that tent to the sound of the morning birds of the forest. He clears everything away, packs away his camp, and continues his journey through the rest of that forest. And he hacks through and pushes through, pushing on for that mountain range. And after half a day's travel through the forest, he reaches the base of the mountain range, begins to ascend, and as he climbs, he eventually passes the tops of the trees and can look back over that forest, can see that clearing, can see the forest beyond. He continues to ascend, and as he ascends, so the greenery around him thins out. Trees are the first to begin to be left behind, and then shrubs, and eventually he reaches a line where the grass is being covered by the slightest smattering of snow. And where that grass is thinning, and he finds himself walking more on dirt and snow, and feeling that cold on his cheeks, while he's wrapped up so warm in a jacket. And he pushes on, climbing higher and higher up into this mountain range. And after almost a whole day's journeying, he eventually finds what he came looking for. He finds the entrance to a cave, and he heads in through that entrance, And as it is now beginning to get late and the sun is setting for another day, he decides that he'll explore the cave in the morning, that for now he'll rest. And so he sets up a camp in the entrance to the cave, sets up a fire, and sits back and relaxes, watching that fire dancing, gazing out over the evening sky as the stars and moon rise and pass across the sky. Watching the way the flames dance on the cave walls, that orange glow, and the warmth from that fire, and the occasional cool burst of air that will come into the cave, that Dexter feels on his cheeks, before settling down and drifting, floating comfortably asleep. And the next day Dexter awakens, clears everything away and heads deeper and deeper into the cave. And as Dexter walks deeper into the cave system, so he can hear those footsteps reverberating around. Hear the distant dripping of water. And feel the stillness of that air. And after a while, Dexter finds himself coming out in a large cavern. He places some torches around the cavern to illuminate the whole cavern. He settles down next to the lake in the cavern and can notice that that lake is lapping incredibly gently on the shore. But he's surprised at how still that lake generally is, that it's lapping so gently. And Dexter, relaxing down next to that lake, begins to just gaze up towards the ceiling. He can notice the stalactites hanging from the ceiling, noticing the occasional drop fall from them into the lake, sending the tiniest of ripples out across that lake. And as he watches, it's almost as if one of those drips happens in slow motion, like he notices it just as it's leaving the stalactite, and watches as it falls like an almost perfect sphere down towards that water, and that the way it hits the water in slow motion makes it seem almost like it struck a liquid far more viscous than water, with the rebound throwing up a couple of little drops of water that splash back down, sending out those tiny ripples to the shore. And as Dexter rests there watching that, he notices a curious sight. He sees coming into view across the lake what looked like 100 paper boats, initially floating with order, before spreading out, with the tiny ripples creating chaos among those boats as they spread further and further out and around the lake, where those tiny, almost imperceptible ripples create just enough variation across the lake that as those boats travel, so they spread out further and further until the boats seem relatively evenly spread across the surface of this lake. And Dexter realizes that those boats were moving. He just suddenly has that epiphany that the boats were moving. They weren't just static. They were travelling across the lake, almost as if they're being pushed or pulled. And yet he can't notice any movement other than those tiny ripples from the drops. And he's aware that overhead is an entire mountain range, stretching up way above the cave. And below is the rest of the mountain range, all the way down to the ground. And he watches as those boats, now spread across the whole lake, seem to be beginning to get funneled to one point at the end of the lake. And so he continues to watch with curiosity. He can notice that the boats are becoming so damp that many of them have turned on their side, have lost their form. And he sees that they all seem to be heading to one specific point at one far side of the cave. And so he walks over nearer to that point, and he sees in the water what looks like a tiny hole. And he recognizes that there must be a channel perhaps carved out, maybe by some rock being slightly weaker than the surrounding rock. And that it's really narrow, but it seems to be sucking the water from this cavern, from within this cave, out through that really narrow channel. And as he watches, so he notices the boats arriving at this side of the cavern, that the influence on the entire lake, with the lake being so still, of this one tiny hole was amplified because of how still the lake was. And as those paper boats back up, all crushing against each other, he notices them beginning to clog that hole, beginning to get sucked down under the water to where the hole is. And the hole's so small that barely a single paper boat can fit through. But as he watches, he notices that the paper, being wet, is dissolving in the water. It's being broken down as the water is passing across that wet paper and passing through that wet paper, breaking it down into tiny pieces, which are then continuing to flow through that hole and off to wherever that leads. And Dexter had no idea where that led, but he just watched with curiosity as an idea formed in his mind, greater and greater with every passing moment. And just then, Dexter awoke on that chair. He knew what he had to do. He understood his experiment. He went back to the lab. He explained to the other scientists how it is that the experiment can work, where they've been going wrong. He explained that to control the reaction, you need to create a large barrier between one chemical and the other. And then the third igniting chemical can be in dissolvable form, so that the right amount is in its own tiny dissolvable capsule. And these capsules that he's talking about are microscopic. And he talked about having a way of passing those microscopic capsules of that chemical into the device, and a way of them travelling out of the device as the reaction happens. And so, over the coming weeks and months, he built a prototype of the device with a large outer shell, and around the outside of that outer shell was one chemical, and then pressure is applied to that chemical, and that pressure enables that chemical to seep through that shell. But it does so incredibly slowly. And what drips out from the bottom of the shell is such a small quantity, just individual particles dripping from the roof of the shell. And they're able to do the maths to make sure that the pressure on the outside leads to the exact amount they want dripping on the inside. And those individual particles drip down into the chemical inside, causing a reaction, a change to that chemical. And then that chemical flows through a very narrow tube. And as it does, one capsule at a time passes along that tube, dissolves as it's passing along, with the chemical reaction happening at the end of the tube. And Dexter demonstrates that this works, and is incredibly excited by this, aware that these chemicals are abundant enough, and this creates such a high amount of energy and it's cheap enough that it can be set up in different countries on different scales. None of the chemicals on their own are a problem, and if mixed in too high a quantity in the wrong way, it doesn't create a reaction. The mixture has to happen in just the right way. And it's only through a process that they had been trialling that it can be mixed. And these devices could be set up on different scales. They could be set up as small devices for individual households, where a small amount of the readily available chemicals could be used to offer incredibly cheap, environmentally friendly fuel to those households. On a larger scale, it could be used to power cities or factories. And unknown to Dexter at the time, a few decades after his work, the very first Dexdrive was made. And one was tested on a satellite to power the satellite in a fuel-efficient way. And then they tested it on a space station. And then they tested it as a drive used to go to the moon. And the way the Dexdrive worked was that with very little mass of fuel, the drive could create thrust, allowing ships to travel at high velocity, rapidly reaching the moon. They used the same process in moon bases, so that they wouldn't have to keep taking any fuel to the moon to power those moon bases from Earth. Everything they needed was already there. And they used the moon as a launching point, developing huge spaceship which would set off from the moon across the solar system before launching one for Alpha Centauri, where the Dexdrive is used to accelerate a ship to a good percentage of the speed of light. Where that ship flies past the stars, swings round close to the stars, using them to direct the ship back in the direction of the sun, with the additional speed of coming so close to the stars, gathering data from this new destination, and within a generation having a ship arrive, pass around stars, and head back, slowing on its final half of its journey home. Arriving back at Earth. And the technology for the Dexdrive became the technology that allowed humankind to be freed from energy poverty, and to then free itself from the shackles of the earth, to spread tentatively to the moon before launching for the stars. And whole communities setting off on ships in different directions, who had intense curiosity about what is out there, and a desire to go and explore, to make trips into the unknown, like their distant ancestors making trips into the unknown across oceans and across vast land masses, with no knowledge of what they would discover, just some supplies and skills for surviving. And just like their ancient ancestors, a knowledge that the further away from those they knew that they get, the more they have to value those they've got with them. And like ancestors, may never have saw those they left behind ever again, due to the vast distances of travel. And their focus would be forward on carving out a new life in a new world. These communities travelled out in all directions to begin the process of populating the galaxy one star system at a time, where many dozens of communities travelled out in many dozens of different directions to the nearest stars. And by the time they reached those stars, the size of the communities on the ships will have expanded. And some in those communities would settle down a significant community on a planet in a star system where they decide they want to take hold and forge their own path. And they would set up well with the Dexdrive knowledge, with instant, easy to access energy supply, and knowledge of various fields of study and various resources. And those dozens of communities setting off within a generation or 2 generations become many, many dozens. And then within 3 or 4 generations become thousands of generations travelling in different directions, exponentially growing around the galaxy. Every couple of generations, until within a few thousand years, a large proportion of the galaxy is colonized by distinct communities, many of whom over time may forget the story of how they got there, where they came from. And Dexter's legacy continued on thousands and thousands of years. And yet, Dexter himself just went home one night after this incredible creation. Didn't really give it a huge amount of thought. He was excited for his discovery, for being successful. He was filled with curiosity about possibilities of the future, but unaware of the domino he'd knocked over, and how that was going to change the future for everyone. He just went home, settled down in bed, and drifted and floated so peacefully, so comfortably asleep.